Hey guys, how are you? Um, I have had no internet all day. It's been frustrating, but I am in a train in Mississippi and on my way to New Orleans, and it's a sleeper car. You probably can't see any of that, but it's pretty cool. I recommend it. So I guess what I'll do, this is as awkward as I promised it would be. I have some notes here, and I'll just sort of read from them about the Marx reading and capitalism, and try not to be too awkward about it. Okay, let's okay. Um, right. So as I said, the Marx and the Lebo readings were leading up to reading Rachel Carson, and the motivation is to try to for doing that is to try to understand how capitalism works and why it would allow things to happen like the use of DDT and other petrochemicals that are hazardous to human beings and to the environment. That seems like it's not a good thing, but what are the alternatives? Um, and before we get to alternatives, we're using the Marx piece just to try to understand um, a little bit about the history of capitalism, and as I said, he's got some very specific ideas about why it's not a good thing for individuals, but we don't have to focus on those. We just sort of want to understand how it works first and then figure out what we think about it after that. Um, so, as this reading that we just did is from his 1844 manuscripts, and those were not released during his lifetime. They were published in 1927. So 1844, he's pretty young at that point, and a lot of people see these, they're really notebooks, as the beginning of his economic and social philosophies. And they're extremely raw, and the language is powerful. The ideas aren't fully developed, but they're pretty well developed. They're leaping from maybe not his head, but somewhere around the neck area here. If they were from the head, they'd be totally done. That's just how the head works. Um, okay, so I wanted to choose these manuscripts because of what I just said. We could have read Capital, or we could have read the Communist Manifesto. The writing is a bit more refined in those, but I really like the youthful exuberance of the 1844 manuscripts. In particular, I had you read manuscript 3, and it's the one that focuses on how capitalism separates people from society. And then the last part talks about how capitalism separates people from other people on the individual level. Um, so hopefully you're able to get through them and enjoyed some of the fiery language, and you can adopt it for your own manifestos when you write those. Um, so, saying here. So the main point here is that human beings are, in Marx's view, being socialized into fully accepting their lives as wage laborers, and he sees that necessarily as being less than human. Um, he talks about how earning a wage itself in this new system is replaces human desires. So, sorry about all this shuffling around. I'm trying to get this thing so it doesn't fall down. Um, Earning a wage becomes the thing that gives value to life on its own, as opposed to things like having conversations or reading books or writing or going to the theater or riding a bike around or whatever. It's the pursuit of money. And money ostensibly can buy a lot of the things that we need, but for the wage laborer, there are two problems. One, the wage laborer never earns enough to be able to accumulate um, those things that he or she wants. And the leisure time, that's another thing that money can buy, is leisure time. Because if you don't have to work because you have money, then you have time to do whatever you want. So in this system, a lot of people never make it past break even, and that's intentional. That's not one person's insidious plan. It's just the way the system has to work. All the profit goes to the person who has the capital to start things happening. And this is all Marx. This is not what I'm telling you. You're free to evaluate it on your own. But I hate recording this thing. I gotta be honest with you. Okay. The other problem for the wage laborer is that there's this whole thing he goes into about how a person's morality, how moral or good a person they are, starts being judged by how much money they are. So there's this sort of implicit judgment by people that the less money you have, the less good you are somehow as a human being. You're not as deserving of money as others with more money. So you have two options. You can either accept that and say, okay, fine, I will just be looked at as this awful person, or you can try really, really hard to save your money so that people don't see you that way anymore, and therefore you're not spending money on things like leisure time or books, or he talks about food and the enjoyment of food rather than just being sustained by it. And he talks about those things as sort of the natural human condition, the things that we desire naturally. And so we're sort of repressing our own human essence so that we can keep this system going. So he starts questioning ownership at all in some very fundamental ways. He talks about how the landowner becomes an agricultural capitalist out of necessity, or he uses his land to engage in industry out of necessity because the land itself becomes less and less valuable. He talks about because of inflation, so you have to do something with it, or you end up losing it. But what's the alternative to all that? I mean, that's a question we're going to ask. And first we'll evaluate whether or not we think this is true, and then we'll ask what else could we be doing. So I have a quote here from Capital, Das Kapital. I don't know German, I'm just pretending. The inauguration of the capitalist era dates from the 16th century. The process consisted in the tearing of masses of men from their means of subsistence to be hurled as free proletarians on the labor market. In the 18th century, the law itself became the instrument of the theft of the people's land, and the transformation of communal land into private property had for its sequel the parliamentary form of robbery in shape of the Act for the Enclosure of Commons. And I put that in there for two reasons. One, to impress upon you that capitalism, as we know it, the free market system, isn't that old. I mean, the only other true free market system, there's sort of a pseudo free market system with slavery and stuff, was in ancient Rome. So there were free markets there and plenty of capitalists. But then things changed for a long, long time until about the 16th century, when these feudal lords start becoming landlords. And basically what's happening is, as the feudal lords are releasing their peasant serfs to become free people, they're starting to charge them rent, so that the people who had been living on this feudal land before, they didn't have to pay rent. What they would do is grow food or produce, they would just produce the stuff they needed themselves. Every family would do that, clothes and food. You could go gather firewood, and you were basically entitled to this land as long as you gave the feudal lord a share. Once the feudal lord says, okay, you are now free, you owe me rent, instead of just being bound to me by some kind of agreement. It seems on one hand like that's a good thing, like, yeah, now I'm free. The other part of it, though, is that you don't have any money, and you don't have any way of getting money? What would you do for money? I mean, there aren't big industries. There are, a few trade unions and things like that. So that creates a whole bunch of people who need stuff to do to earn money so they can pay their feudal lords. And that just paves the way for really, really oppressive conditions um, because people are desperate. And you start talking about the enclosure of the commons, and that was a legislative means of feudal lords enclosing what used to be common land. Feudal lords and also big time like rich farmers. It used to be common land, and people would just go use it, and you could gather firewood or raise livestock or whatever, and it didn't really belong to anybody. It was all shared. But the landowners were able to, if they put a fence around it, uh, for various reasons in this legislation, they could claim it as their own. Um, the other part of that is, well, one thing is that a lot of people were too poor to have fences, and that's true. Um, so the people with access to the ability to make a fence big enough to put around land had an advantage there. But there were also these 99-year leases that people had. In some cases, they were infinite leases on the land, and the feudal lords really hated, well, their landlords at this point hated that because you're bound to the same rent uh, agreement as forever. And with inflation, that's not a good thing at all. You're going to be losing money. And so there was legislation that made it okay for people to trade among each other, sell land, give it away, and take over somebody else's land. And in doing that, you would then have rights to the land. So it was actually legislated in that these common areas could be taken over by the landlords, and also that the leases could be broken with the new free people, small-time farmers and subsistence laborers. So let's see where I am in my notes here. I'm sorry, I was supposed to be reading this on my computer screen, but for various reasons I couldn't do it. Okay, so what? I guess I wrote a couple questions here. What would Marx prefer to feudalism? He prefers feudalism to capitalism pretty clearly in this manuscript. But what does he prefer to that? I mean, clearly being someone's peasant serf isn't a great situation. But I do think that he's hinting in these early manuscripts that he really does prefer a more Gandhi-like conception of humanity, where we're not just producing as much as we can because we can do it. We could figure out how to do it. We are producing what we need for ourselves and our families. And a common retort to that is, yeah, but what about like medicine? Isn't that a good thing for us to have? If everybody were just growing food and making clothes, we wouldn't have penicillin and these things that save people's lives, and that's true. We probably would never have that stuff, or computers or cell phones like this one. Um, and so then he begins talking about division of labor and people's natural talents for certain kinds of activity. And it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. So, do people develop natural talents because of division of labor? Meaning, I need a job, and there are a lot of people looking for jobs, and I know the factory needs somebody who's really fast with their fingers, so I really work on my dexterity so that I can sew things faster than other people or whatever. Do those talents emerge because of the division of labor, reducing what we do to these like small tasks, or are particular people's propensities for certain kinds of activities what leads to the division of labor in the first place? Are we taking advantage of people's, not taking advantage, are we using people's natural talents in a better way by dividing labor up into what they're good at, and in some cases what they prefer to do, but that's probably rare in these cases. The thing I didn't mention is not only did you have to pay this rent as a newly freed person, you could also be thrown in jail for not having a job. You could be sent to Australia to a penal colony, or you could be put to death for being unemployed. So that's another impetus to go work in a factory or whatever. So he doesn't end up resolving this problem in the way it looks like he's going to. He quotes a lot of what he calls political economists, including Adam Smith, who's extremely famous, and others, and they've got different takes on what came first, division of labor, people's talents. What he says in the end is that the division of labor combined with a free market economy and capitalism leads to this problem of wage laborers giving away their humanity, and that's a really, really bad thing. Because we also start believing that that's what we're meant to do. We are socialized into accepting those conditions. And there's a book from 1909 or 10, I can't remember exactly, called The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists. And it's not a very famous book at all, except for academics and in certain social circles. But the main character is someone who's trying to convince his friends not to be wage laborers anymore and to sort of rise up with him and overthrow the capitalist system. And his friends are all like, "You're crazy, man. This is what we do. We are blue collar workers, and this is what we're meant to do. And why are you putting on airs and trying to be more than you deserve?" So part of the point of that book is that people really start believing they're not entitled to things that they haven't been born into. Okay, good. So that's all Marx, and there's a lot more in that manuscript. It's really, really packed, but those are some of the main problems he sees with capitalism. But encapsulated in that is what I told you about the way free market economy came into being in England. That's where all this started, and it really has flourished since then. I'm going to put up a link to Milton Friedman, a pretty famous talk he gave on a pencil, and how a pencil is produced and what a miracle it is of capitalism that we're able to do that at all. No one person could make a pencil. That's his point. No one person could make a cappuccino. That's a modern take on it, and he'll explain why to you. So there's some real benefits to the system, also. But what are the drawbacks? And Marx has named some, and you may or may not agree with those. There is something that's indisputable, though, and it's that capitalism produces so much stuff, extra stuff, that has to be sold, that it forces us to purchase more than we may have needed naturally. I say may. I mean, it's still a question whether we really need growth, constant growth to sustain ourselves or not. But what is true is that capitalism, the way it exists in our world, as a growth engine, it has to produce tons and tons of stuff, extra, more and more all the time, and it has to sell that stuff. It has to find markets for it, and that's where marketing comes into play. Marketing, advertising, hence the Victor Lebo. So what I would like you to do, I'll make a discussion forum, and I'd like you to write about this Marx stuff. I want your reaction to this, but then the Lebo stuff I had you read. I want you to speculate as to why I wanted you to read that, and we can go from there. Read as much of Rachel Carson as you can. Try to read chapters at least to chapter 6 and to chapter 10 if you can, and we'll start working on that on Thursday. Until then, be well. Wish me luck. I'm going to be pulling into New Orleans in a couple hours, and from what I've heard, I may not make it back just because it's so fun and dangerous. Okay, guys, be well.